Cross joining me. And Ben, as I bring you on, good morning. How are you?
Morning, Jonah. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
It's been a little bit. It's been a little bit. I know there hasn't been so much to cheer about on our personal schools fronts. So that's part of the reason why I haven't had you on in a little bit. But no, I appreciate you taking some time.
Jonah, are you forgetting the volleyball championship that the
That's
Wisconsin
true.
women won a few weeks ago? That was significant. We don't win many championships, as you
That's
know.
true. You know what? I did
As-
talk about it. I did talk about it on the show. I did, but we haven't really talked about it between you and I very much. But that was very cool. That was very cool. And actually, when you and I went to Wisconsin, that's kind of when they first started to become really relevant, starting to crack into the top 25. They weren't making that kind of national noise just yet, but they were starting to be put on the map a little bit more. So that was cool.
Yeah,
Uh,
it was very cool.
Okay, so I want to talk with you, Ben. The college football playoff, the national semifinals are coming up this Friday. It's kind of crazy that it's already hit this Friday. I feel like we kind of forgot about it the last couple of weeks because it's kind of hasn't been at the forefront of our minds. But I want to start with Alabama and Cincinnati because I think that this is an interesting matchup. Listen, here's the interesting thing to me, and I want to hear what you have to say. But for me, Alabama's offense, okay, it's been prolific all year. They haven't necessarily been known for their defense, though they're actually a top 5 rushing team. And we saw against Georgia that they're more than capable of clamping down defensively when you've got a bazillion 5-star athletes. For Cincinnati, what's interesting to me, Ben, is obviously Desmond Ritter. What I like about him is he doesn't turn the ball over that much. He takes care of the football. He's got like 30 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, but he can move. And normally, kind of dual threat quarterbacks pose some problems for Nick Saban. But to me, it's not even about that. It's about the Bearcats' defense because their defense and their secondary in particular is excellent. The problem is, that the kid's name is Kobe Bryant, actually, the cornerback, but it's spelled with a C as opposed to a K, which is pretty crazy. But the thing to me, Ben, is I view this matchup kind of like an NFL team playing the Kansas City Chiefs at their peak, which is it's not that I'm concerned about Cincinnati's defense being able to slow down Alabama, just like it is facing the Chiefs. What I'm concerned about is whether or not Cincinnati's offense can match the firepower of Alabama's offense. That's how I see it. How do you see this matchup?
Well, I think you're 100% spot on. I do think Cincinnati absolutely has the talent and the experience to keep up with Bama. I think what's interesting about this matchup is you said Bama is like the Chiefs. What's interesting with Bama is they showed up against Georgia and they absolutely spread out that incredible defense and dominated them. But if you look back just a week prior, they really struggled on offense against an Auburn team that had a backup quarterback, a quarterback that hasn't played all that well in Finley. And they also struggled against A&M. They put up points in that game, but they lost that one. They struggled against Florida, LSU. This is not an unbeatable Alabama team. You look at some of the champions of the last few years, Alabama last year, LSU the year prior. Those were unstoppable teams. They blew out everyone they played. That isn't this Alabama team, and a Cincinnati team that can do what Georgia didn't do, which is keep drives alive. Desmond Ritter's a phenomenal quarterback. I think he can keep the drives going and stay ahead of the sticks on first and second down, but also convert tricky third and longs, third and manageables. And if they can do that, control the clock a little bit, I think they prevent Bama from stretching the field. Their secondary can drop back and limit some of those incredible Alabama wide receivers like Williams and Mechie. And I think potentially keep this closer than a lot of people might think. So I think it's going to be an interesting matchup. I definitely am not saying Cincinnati should be favored to win, but I absolutely think that they can hang with them, and I wouldn't be shocked at all if it was a close game, say, going into the fourth quarter. Cincinnati, as we talked about, they have experience across the board. They have some standout players. People forget Desmond Ritter was in the conversation for the Heisman until later in the year when Cincinnati sputtered a little bit. But Bama is not unbeatable, and I absolutely think Cincinnati, if they, as you mentioned, Ritter can't make mistakes. He has to be reasonable in the pocket, convert third downs, keep drives alive. If they can do that, I think they absolutely can keep up with them, and not just keep up with them in an absolute shootout, but actually control the time possession and the speed of the game a little bit and make it a more manageable score that they'd have to catch up to.
I mean, it would certainly be a tremendous storyline if Cincinnati was able to win. I mean, talk about a referendum on the committee for for years if they were able to win that. But it's also funny to me how Alabama, we kind of just forgot the fact that they won the championship last year, and then they're back this year again after beating Georgia. So it's funny what can happen in a couple months. Okay, let's now transition to the second semifinal matchup, Georgia and Michigan. I had a hard time picking between these two teams, Ben. I'll say I have, at this moment, again, my emotions may change, depending on the day that I wake up. I am giving a narrow edge to Michigan for a couple reasons. I think that there's no question Georgia's defense is elite. There's no question about that, and they've given teams problems all season. The thing, though, about Michigan that impresses me is their ability to run the football. I mean, Hassan Haskins, what they did to Ohio State, even though they still, C.J. Stroud still threw for like 500 yards, but the bottom line is they controlled the line of scrimmage. They were really physical up front. And I do think that Michigan, even though they're not known for their defense or their offense, they're kind of just known as being a tough physical run team. And that's been a recipe that's worked for them really well. They're like a top 10 team in the red zone on offense. Georgia can't finish in the red zone. Now they have the best red zone defense. But what I think that this game's going to come down to is Haskins and McNamara making a couple more plays than Georgia. I think because of field position, it's going to be a big field position type of game. And I'm just not sure if Stetson Bennett can produce enough offensively to weather whatever this Michigan kind of attack is. They're on this special season. Again, I'm not heavily leaning towards Michigan, just slightly edging in their favor at this moment. Where do you lean on this matchup?
I'll actually go a different direction. I'm heavily leaning toward Georgia on this one. I know both of these teams pretty well, and if you look at them throughout the year, as you mentioned, Georgia has that phenomenal defense. It's mostly centered on the run. The reason Georgia got exposed on defense in the SEC championship was because Bama stretched them out. They didn't have a big run game. They ultimately just tried to work it to their athletes on the perimeter, and they pushed it downfield and didn't have any problems with that. If Georgia has any weakness in their defense, it's in their secondary. And Michigan doesn't really have the firepower to keep up with that. I know they have good athletes, but their receivers are not what makes that offense great. As you mentioned, Hassan Haskins was one of the reasons that they were able to beat Michigan. Georgia will be able to stack the box and key in on that. And I don't think Michigan's going to score that many points. I just don't think McNamara is all that explosive. He's efficient on third downs, and he's a solid quarterback. He doesn't make a ton of mistakes. But Ohio State does not have a great defense. They don't have a great secondary. And Michigan was able to come out with a balanced attack and not make any mistakes and beat an Ohio State team. But they didn't necessarily blow them out. And I think Georgia might absolutely shut down this Michigan offense. And if you look on the other side of the ball, Georgia's offense isn't necessarily going to blow the top off. Michigan has a phenomenal defense, but I just think Georgia's not going to make any mistakes. I think they're going to do what they need to do. They have a great run offense and a balanced passing attack. Stetson has a better arm than people realize, and I think ultimately Georgia's just going to come out a couple weeks of rest after they got embarrassed. I think Michigan's coming in a little too confident, maybe. We certainly know Michigan fans, and we know that fan base and that team. I think they don't really know the kind of talent level outside of Ohio State that they're going up against. And I think Georgia's ultimately going to really control time possession. And I think they're really not going to be able to score all that much. And that's really going to frustrate Michigan. And we'll see what happens. I mean, if you look at the Michigan-Wisconsin game, for instance, Michigan was losing at half 10-7. And that was a great. I
don't want to think.
Well, that's fair. I'll just bring up the point that Wisconsin has a phenomenal defense, and they held Michigan to 7 points in that first half. And if Graham Mertz was playing in that second half, there's a good chance Michigan wouldn't have scored nearly as much as they would have, and Michigan would have sputtered most of the game. And I think Georgia's going to do the exact same thing, but they won't have Graham Mertz at quarterback, and that is a big step up for them. So I actually think Georgia has a good chance to dominate this game.
And I personally would love to see that. I wouldn't be upset about that at all if that were to happen.
You and me both.
Okay, I want to transition to the NFL really quickly. I know you are a huge Dallas Cowboys fan, but for the first time in a long time this year, it actually is. It makes sense to talk about them for positive things. So they
one of the few.
So listen, I didn't put too much stock into their blowout win over the Washington football team, even though I think their defense has proven time and time again they're elite. My attention shifted to their offense because Dak bounced back against the Washington football team, but I'm not necessarily sure if they've come all the way back to where they were at the start of the year, if they're going up against teams with the firepower like the Packers and the Rams and the Bucks. Where is your confidence level as it relates to the Cowboys offense after that impressive performance on Sunday?
Well, I think that's a good point. I think that's where you kind of have to focus on if you're looking for what changed for the Cowboys. Their defense has played phenomenally in the last few weeks. In fact, it's been some of the only reasons that they've won games. But if you look at the offense, yes, they improved, but a lot of the points that they were able to put up against Washington came from great defensive plays, the defense pinning them, a pick six. It wasn't necessarily all offense. If you look at the second half, I believe Washington was tied with Dallas at the end of the fourth quarter at 7-7 in that specific quarter. And the offense didn't necessarily do a ton in the third quarter either. So I think if you're looking at that offense, they still need to improve. They need to be more balanced. Zeke and Pollard have been a little damaged and struggling with COVID. If those two running backs can come back and their offensive line can be healthy approaching the playoffs, then I think they can have a much more balanced attack, ease up for Dak. I think Dak had to force a lot more in the passing game in previous weeks. And while he's an accurate quarterback, I think he's still struggling with some certain lingering issues injury-wise, and he hasn't necessarily been as accurate as he'd like to be. If he can continue to get more space and time because the run game is helping them on first and second down, then I think they can be as explosive as they were early on in the season and potentially compete with any team in the NFL. I think what's interesting about the NFC this year is there aren't a ton of teams. I mean, you look at the Packers, but beyond that, maybe the Rams. A bunch of teams are inconsistent, and it's not necessarily looking like any team is running away with it. And I think the Cowboys, among that other group of teams, as I mentioned, the Rams, the Packers, Cardinals are sliding off a little bit. Any team could win that conference. I think the fact that the Packers will most likely have home field advantage throughout will help them a lot. But I think if the Cowboys can fix some of those issues on offense, continue to be more balanced with their rushing attack, which they were against Washington, Pollard and Zeke complement each other pretty well when they're at their best, but they need to be at their best if this offense is going to click the way it did early on in the season. And I think they have a chance to do that. I am curious to see how it develops. I'm not necessarily predicting that it will bounce back to that level, but I think they have every bit of an opportunity to.
Listen, all they need is for the Packers to lose one more time and they win. I'm pretty sure that they would have. Is it because of the conference record?
Conference tiebreaker record, right?
Okay, so I also want to shift to the NFC West. At the start of the year, everyone thought, including myself, this was going to be the best division in football. And in fairness, there's a strong argument to be made that it still is the case. But the reason why we expected that from that division was because we also assumed that the Seattle Seahawks would be a lot more prominent than they are right now. And there's obviously clearly there was a lot of patchwork that was done in the offseason to try and prevent leaks. Well, it's been leaking and it's fully kind of flooding right now. And to be fair, Russell Wilson hasn't played very well since his injury. He's actually played really poorly. But I also don't think that Pete Carroll has necessarily helped him out with his offensive game plan. And I think that this is going to be a big offseason for John Schneider. And listen, he's on the hot seat too, even though he has a contract extension till like 2026 or 2027. But I mean, what types of changes do you think need to occur this offseason? Is it more, Russell Wilson just needs a new environment at this point in his career, or maybe they keep him but they move on from Pete Carroll, or maybe it's some other kind of decision they need to do?
I think ultimately they will part ways with Pete Carroll, but I don't necessarily believe that that's the right thing to do. I, unfortunately, for the sake of Seattle, think that they're in complete rebuild mode. I think they need to move on from Russell Wilson, whether or not they move on from Pete Carroll. I don't think Russell Wilson wants to be there. And to your point, he hasn't played all that well the past 2 seasons, battling injury or not. He is aging, and I don't think he's anywhere near where he was at the beginning of his career. And you also have to remember a lot of those Seahawks teams depended on their defense, and they had a balanced rushing attack. They have almost no help in the run game this year. Their offensive line is not spectacular. They have all the weapons they could need at receiver, but their run game isn't really helping them. They're not really all that balanced, and I think they need to build up quite a bit. Defense, they need help rushing the passer. They need help in the secondary. Russell Wilson isn't playing as well as they would like him to, and the run game and offensive line is not playing all that well. So I think they need a ton of pieces, and I think they kind of need to get rid of Russell Wilson, get what they can for him, and move on. I think Pete Carroll is interesting. I think you could maybe convince some of the higher up Schneider to keep going with him and have him be in full rebuild mode. The only issue with that is he will have his hands all over that in the future. So if you do decide to move on from him, it'll still be his team. So I think you could potentially see a big shakeup in Seattle and see Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson leave town. I don't know what Pete Carroll would do, but I'm sure Russell Wilson would find a home somewhere. I think for Seattle, though, there's not much they can do right now that I think would beef them up for next year. Maybe get a good running back, maybe build up their offensive line and hope that their offense can return to some sort of explosiveness to offset some of their defensive deficiencies. But I don't think they have the pieces right now to compete anywhere near the top of that division. As you said, it's a well-rounded division at the top, and if Seattle was up there, it would be almost an unstoppable division. But I just don't think they're that close. I know they were competitive early on in the year, but with Russell's injury, him not coming back all that strong, I don't think they're anywhere near competing for a division title and the playoffs in the future. I think they need a complete reshape.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree. I just think that there's something being off. I actually went to the Rams Seahawks game at SoFi with my dad, and to be honest, listen, it was cool to see Russell Wilson, just the figure, but as far as the kind of the dynamic, the playmaking, the improvisational skills that we're accustomed to seeing from him, wasn't really there. Now, in fairness, the Rams defense is really good, but it's kind of been emblematic of the whole season, really, since his injury. Even before his injury, they really weren't doing that well, in all honesty. Okay, final two questions really quick, Ben, because I know I got to let you go in a minute. The AFC North is kind of like a Western film. It's just a wild, wild West out there. And just every time we buy into the Bengals, the next week they have a huge letdown. Now, I'm not saying that I don't buy into the Bengals, but I'm also saying I don't know if I buy into the Bengals necessarily. When you look at that division, because I feel like that division they're playing with about 4 different playoff spots right now. And I'm not saying all 4 of those teams are going to make it, but when you look at the standings, 4 of those teams are comprising, the 10 or 11 teams that are potentially capable of making the postseason. At this very moment in time, who do you think is the best team in that division? And ultimately, who do you think is going to win that division during the final 2 weeks of the regular season?
I'm split on who I think would win. If I had to pick, I would say probably the Ravens. I think Lamar Jackson coming back really helps that team. I mean, Hundley has been good in reserve, but I think Lamar is just that absolute game changer. There's no one else like him in the league, and I think he really adds that element that defenses can't really fully prepare for. And I think they're the best team because they're a little more consistent. I think the Bengals at their best are the best team in that division, but they're so inconsistent. It seems like they play up to their talent and then they play down to their talent. And you have to kind of find that middle ground if you're going to go into the playoffs and expect to go on the road in tough atmospheres and potentially compete for an AFC and potential Super Bowl. So I think the issue with the Bengals is their consistency, as you mentioned, whether their offense can be as explosive as it has been in some of their bigger games. But I think the Ravens have been there a little bit more. Harbaugh certainly understands what he needs to do at this point in the year. The Bengals are still a young team with a lot of young leaders. And I think the Ravens, ultimately, if they can get Lamar back and healthy, can compete for this division title. Now, the Ravens are a little inconsistent, too. In fact, that entire division is the definition of inconsistency. The Steelers, the Browns, it seems like none of those teams have stepped out with any level of consistency. And I think you'll probably only see the Ravens and Bengals make the playoffs, and I think the Ravens will win the division. The Bengals are a scary team to play in the wild card, but I absolutely think that they could win or lose depending on how they're feeling that day and ultimately burn out at some point in the playoffs. But I think the Ravens have the best chance to go the farthest, and I think they'll ultimately win the division.
I certainly I really respect Joe Burrow. The fact that he tore his ACL, less than a year ago, and he's back and he's playing at an elite level. I just love his moxie. I just love his confidence. So I wouldn't be upset with the Bengals. It's just every week it's a crapshoot. You just don't know how they're going to come out. Okay, final question for you, and I have to throw this in because obviously one of these guys is our kind of Wisconsin guy as well for the MVP race. So listen, Rodgers, should be the leading favorite at this moment in time. I have Brady narrowly right behind him, or maybe not narrowly right behind him, but just behind him. But the problem is both of those two guys, Ben, they've got two things going against them. One is they've obviously won before, which I don't think is always a great thing. But also from a narrative perspective, they both took two big narrative hits at some point in this year. Obviously, Rodgers with the immunized and Brady with the temper tantrum with Dennis Allen and the tablet. Just not a great look for him, even though I think Rodgers' look was a lot worse. So unbiasedly, Jonathan Taylor's our guy, but I also think that a real case can be made for him to be in the MVP conversation, if not atop the conversation at this point, because the Colts are 9-6. They look like perhaps the most feared wild card team in the NFL playoffs right now in the playoff picture. And all 9 wins are a direct reflection of his productivity because he rushes for over 100 yards in all 9 games, and they win those 9 games. Do you give him any shot whatsoever in these final 2 weeks of winning the MVP and maybe stealing it away from Rodgers or Brady?
Well, I think you made a good point. I think Rodgers absolutely has to be at the top right now. I think you look at how important Jonathan Taylor is to the Colts. You look at what happened when Rodgers was out. The Packers offense was abysmal, and him coming back and suddenly they're one of the best teams in the NFL. So I think the importance conversation absolutely has to include Rodgers in it. And with his stats and it being a quarterback award, I think he is absolutely at the top. I think if you look at Jonathan Taylor, he has a chance, but he has to be really big in these last few weeks. I know a lot of people have talked about how, Derrick Henry ran for 2,000 yards and he didn't even get an MVP vote. Well, that was a different year, but regardless, that 2,000-yard mark is going to be really important for JT. If he wants to be squarely in that conversation, have a chance to win, he's actually going to need to pass that mark, which I think he'll needs somewhere like 200 yards a game or maybe slightly less than that to cross that mark. And he'll have to have several more MVP moments. I know he did against the Patriots. That was the big 70 some odd run that ultimately clinched that game for them. And he's run for over 100, I think, in 7, 8, 9 consecutive games. I know he had touchdowns in all of those games except for this last one. He has a chance. And I think he'll ultimately get an MVP vote, but he needs to have huge performances, which is certainly possible. They don't have a strong schedule closing out the year here. He could do it, and they're fighting for a playoff spot, so they're not going to cut his carries at all. But I think he absolutely has a chance to do it, but ultimately I think it's just too much of a mountain to climb. It's too high of a mountain to climb, and he might struggle to get past that point, and I think it'll be Rodgers.
I agree. I think it'll be Rodgers, but man, would it be incredible for JT to win. I just love that now the NFL. I mean, I've been saying since he first came into the league, I was like, listen, you guys don't understand. We've seen this guy in college. He is going to translate into the NFL. Has the work ethic. In fact, I've actually reached out. Unfortunately, the Colts communications department, I've tried bringing him on here multiple times. They've rejected it multiple times. I'm going to get him on here at some point, but it would be a great storyline to see Jonathan Taylor win. I surely hope to see it. Ben, as always, thank you so much for joining me, and happy holidays to you and your family. We'll catch up again soon.
Same to you and yours. Thanks, Jonah.
All right.